In a previous Let's Talk Science presentation, you may recall that Professor Jürgen Unitzer, the chair of psychiatry, reviewed with us the mental health needs of our region. And among those were the need for more trained professionals. And he pointed out to us that the difficulty in that is the time required to train those professionals. And to meet that need, he suggested that we may be considering looking at other mental health service training professions to help fulfill those needs. Among them, for example, physical therapy, nursing, physician assistants, and so on. He also raised the possibility of carefully selecting and training peer counselors or coaches from within retirement centers themselves. So 2 weeks ago, we had the pleasure of having Dr. Patrick Raue, also a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, come here and address that critical scientific question of whether peer counseling is as effective as standard mental health treatment. And as he pointed out, the preliminary studies suggest it is efficacious, as efficacious as standard psychiatric care. But he also described a major national study that he and his colleagues have undertaken of over 600 participants in 18 senior centers in 3 cities in the U.S. to definitively address that question, and we will stay tuned, eagerly awaiting the outcome of that study. But meantime, Dr. Raue is back with us here today, and he returns to address research findings and myths concerning depression in seniors and the difficulties of identifying depression among our population. What are the empirically supported treatment methods available? And most importantly, what self-help steps we all can take to prevent and manage depression when it occurs. So join me in again welcoming Dr. Patrick Raue.
Great, thanks for the wonderful introduction, and very happy to be back and talking with everybody. I see some familiar faces. If you have a hard time hearing me, maybe do this and I'll speak up. This talk, the title you see is A Healthy Outlook, Recognizing Depression in Later Life. There are going to be many times that I'm going to pause and ask your opinions or your observations. And I will, if you speak and say a sentence or two, then I'll repeat what you say to the rest of the room so we all can hear, instead of running around with a microphone. We'll hold larger questions and larger comments to the end as well. Okay, so as Jack mentioned, I'll start the talk with some facts about depression in older adults and some commonly held myths. We'll talk about why depression in older adults is particularly difficult to recognize, both from the healthcare professional perspective as well as from individuals and family members. We'll talk about evidence-based treatment options, and finally, as Jack mentioned, some self-care management strategies that have been found to be particularly helpful. So we'll start in some facts about older adults, and to frame it, no surprise, but the number of older adults in the country is rapidly growing. In 1940, the percentage of older adults, 65 and older, compared to the rest of the population was about 7%. In 2020, we're up to about 17%, and the projections for 2040 are over 20% of the entire population will be 65 and older. That's really pretty striking findings, or projections as well. So, a problem though is that a lot of research has been done showing that as many as 10 to 20% of older adults, if you look over the course of, for example, the past year, would be experiencing some kind of mental health disorder. What do you think are some of the more common ones? depression, isolation, anxiety. Any other common ones? Loneliness. Yeah. That's a very timely comment, because you all may be aware that the Surgeon General just put out a call to action for the epidemic of loneliness. I don't have any slides about that because it just came out, but I'll be ready to talk more about that too. Yes?
Losses, both people that you've lost and also abilities that you lose.
Yeah. Yeah, so when we get older, we lose more people and we lose some of our physical abilities and other abilities. When we're thinking about diagnoses of mental health conditions, depression and anxiety are some of the most common diagnoses that older adults do experience. Curious about whether people think that as we get older, we are more likely to develop depression and anxiety compared to younger and midlife adults. Who thinks that the prevalence and the rates of depression and anxiety get higher as we get older? That's okay. Who thinks that no, it levels off, it's either the same or it gets lower, depression and anxiety? Okay, it's kind of an equal split. And I think a lot of us think that, because we go through so many new struggles when we get older, it's natural that we're going to be experiencing more depression and anxiety. And there's absolutely an element of truth to that. If we are experiencing more medical conditions, more struggles with our ability in taking care of ourselves, more isolation, we are going to be more at risk for depression and anxiety. However, if we look at these large-scale epidemiologic studies, like if we were to go door to door and interview people, the good news is that rates of depression and anxiety are actually a little bit lower for older adults across the board, which is great news, right?
For us.
Yeah. Maybe not for the adolescents, but yeah.
Well, we see all this stuff about adolescent depression.
Yeah, the comment is there's a lot in the news and being published about depression in teenagers, and so that's a real significant problem. Yes?
Would you be clear how you're defining older adults?
Sure. The question is about the definition of older adults, and there's a lot of different ways to define that, but a pretty common way is to define it as 65 and older. Yeah. How about, yes, no.
Does it make a difference if they're retired or not?
Does it make a difference if they're retired or not? We're going to talk about retirement and other life adjustments. Let's see. I think, and it depends on the person and how they cope with retirement is kind of the short answer for that. Yeah. But retirement is a big challenge, and many people kind of are, losing a sense of purpose that they once had. So it depends on whether they pick up and pursue other activities that are important and valuable to them and give them a sense of purpose. What about more severe versions of mental illness like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? Who thinks that as we get older and approach 65 and above, who thinks that the rates of severe mental health disorders raise when we get older? Okay, nobody's, and that's accurate. So those disorders are more commonly appearing in younger adulthood. Yes, ma'am?
Are you counting dementia?
Dementia I'm not counting. Yeah, it certainly is severe. We would say that's a neurocognitive. It's certainly under the umbrella of mental health, but I was more speaking about bipolar and psychotic disorders like schizophrenia. Yeah, but y'all are right that those disorders may exist among older adults, but the rates definitely taper off. Great, so the problem though, despite this, 10 to 20% is still relatively high if we're kind of thinking about older adults and what they're experiencing. Many are experiencing, if we look, over the past year. Unfortunately, even depression and anxiety, you think would be kind of easy to pick up, but they're under-recognized, they're by individuals and their family members. They're underdiagnosed by healthcare and mental health professionals, and they're undertreated. Any thoughts about why we're seeing this and why we're not picking this up and why we're not treating it accurately? We're going to talk a lot about this, but I wanted to get the ball rolling and get your thoughts about why this might be true. Yes?
Is older adults more reticent to seek help?
Older adults may indeed be more reticent to seek help. Part of that could be denying that they need help, seeing it being, their lot in life, or having some kind of stigma about what it means about them if they were to reveal this and ask for help. I think that's definitely true. Stigma, of course, exists among younger and midlife people too, but I think older adults also experience that in a different way. Yes?
Or if help isn't covered by their insurance.
Yeah, great point. It might, these services might not be covered by insurance, so cost and payment can be a big barrier to getting the care that we need. Yes?
The process of aging is blamed for a lot of issues. It's just part of getting old.
Great comment. The process of aging, and some people think that these symptoms or disorders are just a part of getting old. It's kind of a form of ageism when you think about it, right? It's saying you're experiencing these distressing concerns and symptoms, but, what else can you expect?
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Right? Yes.
I also think there's a lack in geriatric training for many primary care physicians who see us in their practice and are not trained to ask the questions and engage in a way because they don't have the time and they're not being reimbursed for it. It goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
But I think there is a gap between the kind of training that people get in medical school as they move into practice situations that make them at least aware of the importance of probing for this kind of thing.
Yeah, the comment that I totally agree is that there's often a lack of training among the healthcare and even mental health care clinicians that see older adults, that they may have never been trained to pick up symptoms of depression and anxiety, and they may not have been trained to treat it appropriately. And even mental health professionals, that not every mental health professional has been made aware or trained in this as well, which is particularly disturbing, right? Yes?
Once upon a time, we had a grandma, we had an auntie, we had mother's best friend that we would go to. That generation, that tradition no longer operates. Grandma is on the other side of the country and doesn't have time because she's now dancing, she's doing other things. So we haven't moved into that kind of acceptance of going to a relative, of going to a friend that that our parents had.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I'll try to summarize the shifts in the country that perhaps in the past family and friends were closer knit and lived closer and there was a lot more in-person contact and maybe people felt more comfortable relying and sharing their struggles and what they were going through. Now people are a little bit more dispersed physically and we have a lot less in-person contact than we used to. It's true for adolescents up through older age as well, that phenomenon. And perhaps that, I guess it gets to the comment about loneliness also, that, leads to less tight communities and less feeling connected to other people and having those support systems. Yes?
Maybe you're not asking the right questions when you're trying to recognize it.
Yeah, so healthcare professionals and others may not be asking the right questions or making time in their visit to devote to making the person feel comfortable sharing these things. Yeah. Yes?
Would you say, in all of this mild cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease and the like. Does that fit into this, or is that an entirely different subject?
Yeah, so the comment was a question about whether mild cognitive impairment and more severe forms of when we get to dementia, does it fit into this topic? I'm going to stay focused mostly on depression and anxiety today in this talk, and not talk so much about dementia and picking that up and care for it. So it would be a whole other hour, I think, to cover that. But yeah, thanks for clarifying the focus. Yeah, way in the back.
I think there's also a hesitancy about, from the person's perspective, that the medical professional may lead to a far too dramatic way of treating something or understanding.
Great point. So some hesitancy from an older adult perspective who's experiencing this, revealing this, might be kind of this, well, what's going to happen next? Are they going to overreact? Are they going to put me on a medication that I don't want to be on, for example? Are they even going to hospitalize me? You know, am I going to lose control of my autonomy if I share this? Absolutely. Yeah. Yes?
I used to think men were phobic about going to the doctor, but I find there are women that are phobic also. That seeking an answer or a solution is kind of popular.
So why do you think that phobia might exist?
That's why you're here.
Yeah. So there may be a comment is there may be a phobia about even going to the doctor. Particularly true for some men, but you've noticed it to be the case for some women also. Yeah, and if we're uncomfortable going to the doctor for physical or medical issues, then we're certainly uncomfortable going for emotional concerns. Yeah. All right, we're going to revisit one more comment and then we'll keep going.
I think the data supports that among non-white cultural differences among non-white populations in Africa, Asia, that have a greater tendency to venerate old age and don't look, I'm not predisposed to look on it as a kind of an annoyance or something I could deal with by finding some place to put their mother or father.
Yeah. So the comment was about different cultures and thinking about African American and Asian cultures, and some cultures that may venerate old age more so. And so part of that is, much of that is positive, I think you're saying, right?
Right.
Yeah. Looking to taking care of older adults and more respect to them. That being said, there are also there could be cultural differences in trust of the healthcare and mental health care system. So it brings up the comment about, not even wanting to go to the doctor. And then some cultures may be particularly not inclined because there's a history of, more abusive behavior or more neglectful behavior by the health and mental health community for communities of color. So yeah, both positives and negatives to that. All right, we're going to revisit some of those comments, but it's interesting to look at, I'll talk you through this slide. It's interesting to look at differences in the rates of, we're going to stay focused on major depression, which is a particular diagnosis of one of the more common diagnoses of depression, which is a persistent, long-lasting condition characterized by low mood and low interest and a number of physical symptoms of depression too. So it's not just having one bad day. So rates of depression vary depending on where you find and assess older adults. So like I said, if you did those big door-to-door epidemiologic studies, we're only seeing about 2 to 3% of older adults meeting criteria for a major depressive condition. So again, that's a little bit lower than middle-aged adults. However, if you go into settings where rates of medical illness, disability, pain, social isolation, etc. are more common, not surprisingly, we see those rates of depression go up. So if we're doing surveys and interviews of folks who go to their primary care physician, right? They're just like you and me, but if we get them and we talk to them when they're having a doctor's appointment, interestingly, we see that rates of depression go up to anywhere from 6 to 9%. You know, that's a jump from those door-to-door studies. If we look at assisted living, you know, that goes up to 10%. If we look at those people who are hospitalized, that's 12%. I'm sorry, the green bar is homebound. So folks who are still in their homes, but they're needing home nursing services, that rate is 10%. In the hospital or assisted living, the rates go up to 12 or 13%. Nursing homes is that red bar, and we see rates jump up to 20, 21%. Not surprisingly, right? Or is anybody surprised at any of those? Yeah. So it's helpful to think of the flip side too, and I'll take homebound older adults, you know, about 10%. That means that 90% are not meeting criteria for a major depressive disorder. It doesn't mean they're not struggling, it doesn't mean that they're not, you know, having their issues that they're dealing with, but it just speaks to, it's really helpful to also think of the other side of it, that many folks, even if they're homebound or they're needing home health care or they're in assisted living, they're pretty resilient and they're coping as well as they can. Any other thoughts about differences in rates of depression depending on the setting? Okay, we can come back to that. Consequences of depression. Curious about your thoughts of if we're experiencing that persistent low mood and low motivation and low energy and it's with us most of the day for weeks on end. How do you think that affects us? What are some of the things that we would pay attention and look out for?
Poor decision making.
Poor decision making. How do you think that would kind of manifest itself? What would we be on the lookout for?
Maybe not eating, not getting out, not handling financial affairs.
Okay, great. I'll perhaps not eating, perhaps not getting out of the house, perhaps not managing finances like we might have used to. So part of that, you know, why might that be the case with depression? What does that do? Well, part of it, depression can cloud our thinking and make it more difficult for us to concentrate. So if we're doing our finances, we might get more frustrated and might give up more quickly. Also, if we're depressed, we often tend to have lower energy and low motivation. So we might not be, you know, having the energy and the motivation to get outside or get walking like we used to. So those are things, depression can affect our functioning and how we're handling our day-to-day lives, absolutely. Any other observations? Things, yes?
Maybe you mentioned this in a way, but being less willing to get involved with others, do things with others, go to parties.
Yeah, less willing to get involved with other people. Again, that's part of that low motivation and low interest level. Depression keeps us down. It leads us to withdrawing from other people, which is the unfortunate way that depression gets maintained, right? If we withdraw from things that normally would give us pleasure and meaning and be a mood booster, and we're no longer making the effort to do that, that vicious cycle kind of takes over and keeps us depressed, often. Let's see if my slides share anything else that we didn't talk about. If we're depressed, we are not only less likely to be on top of our finances and other important decisions, we are less likely to follow through on medical treatment recommendations. We're less likely to take our medications. We're less likely to engage in recommended physical therapy, for example. Not surprisingly then, if we have a medical illness, if we have depression too, it can delay recovery from that medical illness. Who knows exactly why, except, there's research showing that depression can actually affect our biology and our stress hormones and inflammation, and that can have a direct effect on our medical status. Depression can affect our psychology and the way we interpret things and cope with things, and can affect our behavior, like those self-care things we were talking about with medication taking and rehab recommendations and things like that. Not surprisingly, it's going to decrease our quality of life. We're not going to be as invested in life and getting the most out of life like we used to. It can affect we mentioned self-care, our functioning. So regardless of our physical ability, if we are depressed, we're not going to be functioning like we are able to function. Social relations we mentioned already. So isolation we talked about that as being a risk factor for depression, but if we're depressed, it can also have us withdraw from other people and make us more isolated than we used to be. Sometimes when we're older and we're more depressed and we might not be totally understanding what's going through, it increases our visits to the doctor. And this use of health services is more of an unnecessary use of health services. So we're trying to find the answer for why am I feeling this way, and we're going to the doctor, and we might not be sharing some of the more emotional concerns, and everybody's confused about what's going on, but we keep going back to the doctor asking for help. And unfortunately, one of the more severe consequences for some people with depression is increasing the risk for suicide and overall mortality. Of course, not everyone who is depressed is feeling suicidal, nor will it lead to suicide, but it is a risk factor, meaning for a small portion of people experiencing depression, it could lead them to make a suicide attempt or die by suicide. And this comment about overall mortality, it means it increases the risk of premature death, even not by suicide. So think about one person with a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease who is struggling but is not depressed and is managing their illness in the best way. Another person with the same severity of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and is depressed persistently for weeks and months, that person is more at risk for premature death than the person who's not depressed. Any thoughts or reactions to any of this? This is summarizing a lot of research findings over the years. Yes?
I'm a retired physician, and is it likely that some of the older physicians are less understanding about some of these problems about depression because, when they went to medical school, they didn't teach about it. Is that some concern?
Yeah, so the comment is that there could be a cohort effect with physician training over the years, and perhaps some of the older physicians who were trained earlier were not trained in how to recognize or treat depression. And we're not making a statement about all older physicians, but it is true as far as that there is more recent training and efforts for our current medical students on these important issues of picking up and actually treating depression themselves without having to refer to a mental health professional. And there are a lot of things that physicians these days can do to manage their depression. Okay, a little bit more about suicide. So depression is the #1 predictor of suicide in older adults. And older adults unfortunately account for 20% of all completed suicides or deaths by suicides, which is 6 times more than the national US rate. Adolescents are the other age group that's particularly at risk for death by suicide. Does this figure surprised anybody? Or any thoughts about why it may be particularly high among older adults?
Just a question whether people who elect to use death with dignity are considered in this cohort.
Oh, great question. Whether people who choose to die with dignity are part of this. That's an interesting question I don't know the answer to. Yeah. Why? Any other thoughts about? Yes.
It seems pretty accepted that older people or depressed people, one of the components of depression is hopelessness.
Yeah.
And hopelessness leaves older people feel more hopeless
Yeah.
than younger people, and makes it more likely to raise the bar for suicide.
Yeah. The comment is on hopelessness in older adults, and that can be a part of depression, and it could be part of depression among younger adults too, but it can certainly among older adults be one of those things that we really look out for as a risk factor for thinking about suicide and possibly following through with that. So we'll always have our antenna up for feelings of hopelessness. Things won't change, things won't improve, and there's nothing that I can do to make anything better. Yes?
I am sad that Robin Williams was unable to be diagnosed.
Yeah.
He knew there was something wrong, but he did not know what. I understand he took his life.
Yeah. The comment was about Robin Williams, a comedian and actor who died by suicide several years ago and suffered, I believe, from bipolar disorder and Lewy body dementia. Okay, so that puts him at a lot of risk, and it's very sad to lose somebody so so talented. Of course, it's many of us may have family members or friends who are affected by this too. So it's a very sad phenomenon. Yes, sir.
Where does chronic pain fit into this discussion?
Yeah, chronic pain is another really big risk factor for experiencing depression, and really, so treatment. It speaks to when we're seeing somebody with chronic pain and depression, the importance of not just attending to depression, but at the same time making sure that pain is as adequately managed as possible. It's a really tight relationship between pain and depression. Yeah.
I'm really surprised at the large 20%.
Yeah.
Is there a common way that older adults will commit suicide? And is there a way that we can, something that we can do to prevent?
Yeah. So the comment was, again, real surprised at this 20% rate among older adults. And when older adults decide to make a suicide attempt, they are more likely to use a lethal method than younger or middle-aged folks. So they're more likely to use a firearm or to jump from off a bridge or a high space, something like that, in comparison to younger folks who might be more likely to attempt to overdose on medication, which of course can be effective, but often may not lead to death. So the other question was, what can we do about this? And this is a whole, there are a lot of priorities, and one is to, make sure that our healthcare and mental health professionals are trained to identify these issues and to offer treatments that are acceptable to older adults. That's a big thing. Just because we know that treatments might work, it doesn't mean that the individual will find them acceptable or pursue them. So we have to find ways to engage older adults and get them more comfortable and decrease the stigma about talking about this. And interestingly, there are things from more of a well, there's societal kind of perspective about, efforts to decrease stigma among everybody, but there are, just by making changes, for example, if we think about bridges and efforts to, prevent people from jumping off of them, has been shown to actually reduce suicide attempts, and partly speaks to the fact that some people may be making a choice to die with dignity, but many people who attempt suicide, they're really suffering, but it's an impulsive decision. So if we put up a little bit of a barrier, that's been shown to reduce attempts because of that impulsivity. Also, if we, research does show if we restrict firearms, and if we help come up with plans for firearm safety, which could mean locking up firearms, unloading them, giving ammunition to somebody else. That also speaks to the impulsivity of attempts and has been shown to reduce attempts and death by suicide. Yes?
Fighting with healthcare organizations to get enough care. If someone's depressed, the continual barrage of bills and denial of payment, etc.
Yeah, the comment is about all of the barriers to getting the care that we need from the healthcare system, and fighting with insurances, filling out forms, having things denied. It's a big barrier, a big problem. Yeah.
Could you comment on the role of shame in recognizing depression? My understanding is that in certain Asian populations, it's not okay to mention that you are depressed or feeling depressed or anything else.
Yeah, so the comment is about the role of shame, which kind of overlaps with stigma, this idea that if I share that I'm feeling this way, or I ask for help or for treatment, it somehow is a black mark on me or on my family too, and then there are certain cultures who may be experiencing that more than others. I mean, we can all experience shame and stigma, but there are some cultures, and you mentioned Asian cultures, that may experience that stigma and maybe promote it more widespread, that you should be feeling shame and don't mention that. One thing to comment too that we didn't talk about, that there are some racial differences in death by suicide, that older white men are particularly at risk for death by suicide. And the older white men get, the more at risk. So if we look at 60 to 70, the rates of death by suicide increase at 70 to 80, and then even more so 80 and above. Whereas the rates for African Americans and those of Latin heritage and for women kind of stay the same, and they don't increase with age. Any thoughts about white men and what makes them particularly vulnerable? There's no easy answer for this, but yeah.
Life expectancy for men is surprisingly getting lower in the United States. I think in most of the world is the United States.
The life expectancy for men is certainly lower than for women, yeah.
To support the stresses of men and the culture as they get older and less confident.
So maybe there's something about the stress that men experience as they get older, particularly white men, with lower life expectancy, with dealing with medical issues as well. The challenges of coping with that.
Well, it seems to me that for privileged classes, like white men, the aging process loses some of those privileges. And that puts them at higher risk for depression because their feeling of being cut off is more.
I think you hit the nail on that.
Used to dealing with, because somebody else has always had to deal with those fallout.
Yeah. White men have experienced historically and today more privilege than any other group, and getting older and losing functioning and losing control and losing jobs and how they've been treated in the past and being treated differently now. You know, they're not coping. We're not coping well with that. Yeah. Yes.
Military background have anything to do with older men taking their lives?
Oh, the question was about military background as relates to older men. I don't think that accounts for the statistic, but folks who have more access to firearms are more, so, you know, police officers and military, that could put them more at risk if they're depressed and feeling suicidal, yeah. Yes?
Is there a difference whether somebody is religious, deeply religious or not?
Yeah, the question is about religiousness, religiosity, and indeed, that can be a protective factor. So we're always looking for, when somebody is feeling suicidal, to ask them and to look into what might be protective factors. And it could be for religious reasons or for feeling connected to other people. That can absolutely be a protective factor. If we are not religious, there may be certainly other protective factors as well. So it's not necessary, but it's shown to have been shown to be positive. Yeah. Great conversation. Let's keep moving on. And so just wanted to recap a little bit about, you know, symptoms of clinically significant depression. Feeling down, empty, hopeless, that somebody mentioned. Another cardinal symptom is when important activities, not just chores and responsibilities, things that we value, don't interest us anymore. We're not motivated. It's a persistent state rather than a short-term reaction. So again, feeling this way most of the day, nearly every single day, for 2 weeks or longer means, okay, this is clinically significant. It's not just a passing down mood that we all have, not just a bad day. It's not, you know, there's a grieving process that we all go through, a mourning process. That's not considered clinically significant depression unless it lasts on, and we're feeling very distressed by that, and we're feeling that way most of the day, nearly every day, and it's lasting months at a time. That's when normal grieving may be converting to depression that needs formal care. And it's not a sign of weakness. You know, again, speaking to shame and stigma, you know, we really need to be talking about depression as a medical condition, just like diabetes is, and something that can affect all of us when we're stressed. So, continuing on that, you know, part of symptoms of depression are what we feel. Feeling sad or empty, feeling guilty about things we've done or not done in the past, and having a hard time letting go of that, beating ourselves up. In some cases, feeling worthless, feeling I have no use or worth as a human being. People actually get to that point when they're depressed at times. Depression can affect the body and can make us feel more tired than normal. It can also make us restless or irritable. By the way, this is particularly true among older men. It can be a common symptom of depression, but anyone can be irritable too. Feeling like no one loves you or that life isn't worth living can be feelings that are signs of depression. We can also observe other signs of depression: sleeping significantly more or less than usual, not because of another medical issue, but because of depression. Eating more or less than usual, and we spoke earlier about having trouble concentrating. And sometimes a memory not at dementia levels, but sometimes, again, depression can affect our thinking and our attention to information and kind of remembering important things. Factors that can lead to depression. Retirement is a big one, and that came up earlier. A huge adjustment if we're not finding other things that give our lives meaning, and structure is really important. So retirement can be a really good thing if it frees up time to pursue other things, but if we don't have a structure after working and pursuit of things that are important to us and challenges, that can lead to depression. Of course, we talked about medical illness, disability, loss of loved ones can lead to more significant depression. Loss of independence, somebody mentioned earlier. Loss of social roles too. We could be transitioning, if we're no longer a parent, if we lose a child, if we lose a wife or a husband, that's very important. And a role that we once had that we may no longer have. Financial strain is certainly a large risk factor for depression. There are also other, those are sort of what we call psychosocial risk factors. These are more medical and biochemical factors. Depression can run in families. In older adults, it's the genetic link is less strong, and what that means is if we've always suffered from depression and we live to older age, then there may be that genetic link. Many people who are 65 and older can develop depression for the first time in their lives, and that's less of a genetic factor and more because of perhaps some brain changes that are going on or more facing challenges that we didn't face when we were younger. Biochemistry changes can make us vulnerable to depression, and certain medications can have side effects that can mimic depressive symptoms. We've talked about this. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly in the interest of time, but it's hard for the person, the older adult experiencing depression, their family and healthcare professionals to pick up depression. Why is that? We mentioned medication before. Some medications can cause fatigue and poor concentration. So those can be symptoms of depression, but they could be totally caused by medications. Certain medical conditions like diabetes and heart disease, of course, are associated with weight loss and low energy. How are we to know? Is it due to the diabetes or is it due to depression? It's complicated. Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are characterized by really pronounced apathy, not just a lowered interest, but I just don't care anymore. And memory loss. And these can be symptoms of depression too, so it's complicated. We've talked about shame and stigma. We've talked about the definition of stigma that I put here, that mental health problems reflect poorly on the person, my family, my community, and this idea of ageism. I'm not depressed or you're not depressed. It's part of getting old. What else can you expect? Again, this is a myth or a false belief. We've talked a little bit about health care systems and insurance. Many primary care facilities are not even set up, and the practitioners are not trained to pick up depression or treat it. Doctor visits are very short, so if you've got a long list of other things to deal with, you are not going to bring up depression, and your doctor may not bring up depression. And we've talked about insurance coverage being limited. All right, going to move now to the good news. Common treatment. So antidepressants have been shown to be effective and safe for older adults. Not everybody benefits from them. Some people experience side effects from them. In many cases, if one medication doesn't work, it can be really helpful to try another medication or to raise the dose. So sometimes it's trial and error. However, the good news is that certain kinds of psychotherapy and counseling can be just as, in some cases, more effective and long-lasting than antidepressants. So that's great news. Two extremely different ways to treat depression, so we have a choice, which is great. Sometimes we can do both at the same time. Social support, staying connected with other people, and some self-help groups have been shown to be really helpful by themselves or as supplements to these other formal mental health treatments. I spoke last time about lay-delivered interventions that are, we're developing the evidence base that for some people, lay health-delivered interventions, if trained and supervised appropriately, can be really helpful. Here are some barriers to just be aware of that are myths or false ideas that can interfere with us getting the treatment or the help that we need. This will go away by itself. And if it's been going on for weeks and months and we're not doing anything about it, it probably won't go away by itself. If we think getting help is a sign of weakness, that's going to interfere with getting help, right? Getting help is shameful. I'm too old to get help. I won't be in control if I get help, that somebody mentioned earlier. And that's this belief that if I say something, my doctor's gonna force me to do something I don't want to do, or might even lock me up. By the way, the only time that somebody might hospitalize you against your will is if you're in active danger to yourself. So if that you are expressing that I am feeling like I'm gonna, use my gun and I'm gonna do it tomorrow. Even if you don't want to be hospitalized, your doctor is legally obligated to have you evaluated and potentially hospitalized. But that's a very rare circumstance, so that's why we put this down as a false idea. Also, I can't tell my doctor how I really feel. And some doctors may not want to hear this, but gradually doctors are becoming more comfortable hearing about this. Other good news, so depression is a very treatable medical condition. Up to 80% of older adults experiencing depression can be treated successfully with a variety of these approaches, and people can start to feel better even within weeks. Sometimes it takes 6 weeks and 8 weeks to see a real significant treatment response for some people, so you got to stick with it. But many people with treatment start to feel better, soon after starting. Taking care of yourself. This is again what Jack was saying in the beginning, how to prevent depression as well as how to manage it if you're experiencing it. Being physically active, getting moving has all sorts of positive impacts, not just health-wise, but to our well-being and our mood and our mental health. Getting involved with other people in our community, being active, fighting that tendency to withdrawal. It can be hard, it takes effort, but it is a good way to manage depression. Seeing your doctor regularly. Recognizing some of those symptoms when you're feeling down, being aware of what that might be, and asking for help and not feeling ashamed. From friends, family members, from medical providers. Also engaging in pleasurable, rewarding activities, things that give us a sense of meaning or purpose. And for me, that could be different from you. It's all individual. But for some people, it could be engaging in intellectual and cultural activities, like taking courses. For other people, it's physical activity. For other people, volunteering and giving back. There's all sorts of research showing the positive personal impacts of giving back to other people. That doesn't mean ignoring ourselves, by the way. It's taking care of our needs, but also volunteering for others. And we all have lots of responsibilities through the days and chores and things like that. But taking time out for doing something just for you, something that you know is going to be a mood booster. And we only have 5 minutes left, but we've had a really rich discussion through this hour, but we can open up to any other comments now. I think the mic's there.
Here. Sam, could you give me the shirt? Have the room and I'll
We concentrate on the 10%, but what can we learn from looking at the 90% that are coping?
Yeah, I love that comment. What can we learn from the 90 or so percent of older adults who may be having medical issues and struggles getting around, struggles taking care of themselves? What can we learn? Yeah, there's a whole movement called positive psychology that is really devoted to really looking at what's going well. How are older adults in these circumstances? How are they being resilient? How are they coping? What can we learn from that? Yeah, it's a whole field, really important new field of study. Not new field of study, but it's getting more attention.
Patrick, over here.
Okay, I'm sorry. One question here, and then we'll go over here.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a retired physician, and I hope that healthcare people today strongly encourage the spouses or whatever partners, people to come in with the patient, because the patient may be unwilling, and in some way I'm sure that the spouse can say, well, you know, she is really showing signs of depression. I hope that occurs.
Yeah, I agree that, having a family member attend medical appointments with the older adults, permission and willingness, of course, but the spouse or the other family member can add so much of the picture about what they're noticing. It can really be helpful for the physician to make a full assessment about what's going on. Absolutely.
I wanted to ask about food. Are there some foods that are helpful
Can't hear.
for depression?
I'll repeat it.
Wait for the mic.
And alcohol too.
Food, and the comment was about food and alcohol and how that might be related to depression. So the first is that there is absolutely a link between poor nutrition or nutritional insecurity, which I'll talk about, and depression. Nutritional insecurity is particularly relevant among more low-income folks or people who don't have access to healthy foods, and that can be an absolute risk factor for becoming depressed. Also, when we get depressed, it can affect our appetite and our self-care. So again, there's another vicious cycle there of we may be when we get depressed, we're less likely to take care of ourselves and eat, nutritional foods that are available to us. Alcohol and other substances also can be a risk factor for depression. It can be a way that we try to cope with being depressed. We're self-medicating. We're drinking more to try to feel better. But of course, we know that alcohol is a depressant and it's not going to it might temporarily numb some of the depression, but longer term will just be tougher for us to cope with depression.
Any other questions? I want to ask you could you comment more about social activity, the importance of many of those things that you mentioned here? Yeah, touch on that.
Yeah, so social, and that segues to, the Surgeon General's report on loneliness and just these findings about, we all, as humans, that's a basic human need to be connected and to stay connected to other people. And it's not just a function of how many people are in our social networks, meaning how many family members and friends we have, or even how frequently we interact with people. It's a lot more important, our own subjective feeling of being distressed, or feeling that we're isolated, or feeling that we don't have companionship, or feeling that we don't have other people who care about us or who we can rely on. That feeling can be so devastating if it stays with us, and can lead to depression. And so I think all of our counseling and psychotherapies and treatments are really a big focus on increasing social connections and feeling more that other people care for us.
I think it's interesting you've mentioned the Surgeon General. The Surgeon General, who is obviously a very successful individual, sort of like the nation's doctor, has confessed publicly or revealed publicly that he has been a victim of profound depression. And the thing, and he's on his campaign, he's appearing on television shows, and you may have seen him, his self-medication, his involvement with people, and getting away from what he characterized as the most critical part that fed his depression, that he had to resist the strongest, was being alone.
and that he's working on it, and including working on it, is going on TV and talking to people about it. I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. And that's a great example of breaking down stigma too, and having these kind of conversations and revealing, even in at a high position of Surgeon General, admitting that he's experiencing that is so powerful at normalizing that.
I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, there was an article about iPods. It's a new technology where you have a program, an app basically, which pretends to be your friend or your counselor or your grandmother, whatever. And this is now apparently being developed with good or bad results. Have you, I mean, is this something that is part of any study at the university?
Not that I'm aware of. The comment is, kind of about how artificial intelligence can kind of be a friend and fill a certain gap. And actually, there's some research also on kind of these electronic pets too. And I think it's all in whether you personally are willing to engage in that and get something out of that. Whether you find an artificial pet to be, a source of companionship, or an artificial or a chatbot or something. But we need more research on that, and it's certainly not going to be the answer for everybody. And we all need social connection. So, but it makes a little bit of a tangent. It doesn't have to be like a deep conversation with somebody else to feel emotionally connected. Sometimes, literally, just going to a coffee shop or having this brief interaction with a sales clerk or the coffee person can satisfy, start to satisfy, because we're having an exchange and encounter. So it all depends on what's important to us and what we interpret as being like a rewarding encounter with somebody else.
Any further questions? So I think we'll close up then, and thank you, Patrick, for coming. And if anybody has personal questions that they would like to address afterward, feel free to come on up. Thank you very much for attending.